I built this bench way back in 2020. You can see how nice and dark the cherry has gotten with a little age. And I did post a video, but it was more of a watch me build this bench video as opposed to a woodworking lesson. And that's what this video is, designed to help guide you through the project. If you do want to build this bench, I'll have a link to the plans in the description below. And I'll also have a link to the matching cherry entrance table and the matching cherry game table that I made just about a month or two ago. I got started on this project by making the legs. For this project, I turned the legs, but if you don't have a lathe, you could also make this same bench with tapered legs, and I think it would look great. And if you're not sure how to make tapered legs, check out the cherry end table project and skip ahead to the 8-minute mark. I'll have a link to that video in the description below. After joining the edge of the board, I'll use the table saw to rip the legs to width. Next, I'll square up one side of each leg, then set up a stop block and cut the legs to size. After squaring the legs up and cutting them to length, I've turned two of the legs really to just get the hang of the lathe and kind of figure out what I'm doing. And I'm pretty happy with the way they've turned out. They're not exactly the same, but they're pretty close. And when they're on either side of the bench, they're definitely close enough. I still have two legs to go, so let's go ahead and get to it. First, I use a combination square to find the center. And then mark it with an awl. And I'll do that on both sides. Next, I'll measure and mark for the profile of the leg. I'll make a mark at 4.5, 4 7/8, 5, and 5 3/8. And again, I'll use the combination square and square across on all four sides of the leg. I've set up a stop block at 4.5 inches, and I'm going to make a shallow pass on each side of the leg to help prevent tear out at the top. Now I've got the leg in the lathe, my tool rest is set up, and I've got a finished leg close by. Occasionally I'll turn the lathe off, hold the finished leg up against the one that I'm working on, and just make sure that everything is lining up correctly. You can see how the profile in the leg lines up with the guidelines in the blank, and I'll be working towards these lines as I turn the leg. Okay, so I've just about finished cutting the profile in the leg. It's not quite finished yet, but it's getting pretty close. When I hold up the finished leg, you can see that that's looking pretty good. Now I want to focus on rounding the leg over. I've moved the tool rest, and I'll slowly work my way down the length of the leg. Okay, so now it's getting pretty close. I've removed the tool rest because I'm not going to use any more tools on this portion of the leg. I'm using a wide sanding block, and this has 60 grit paper on it, and this will help to keep the cylinder consistent in thickness. I measured up 1/4 of an inch at the bottom of the leg for a small step down. My mortising machine, my lathe, and my drill press all sit on top of this mobile workstation, which is also a charging station. This cabinet has tons of storage and has become a great addition to the shop. If you want to build this project for your shop, I'll have a link to the project video and the plans down in the description below. I'll also add a small chamfer to the bottom of the leg, and this will help to prevent chipping when being moved around on the floor. Now that I have the legs turned, the next step is to cut the mortises, and I've taken a little time to make sure the best side of the leg will be facing the outside, and then marked it with an O. And I'm also making sure that the mortises won't meet in the center of the leg. Now we can go over to the mortising machine and set it up to cut the mortises. Before we go over to the mortise, let me just explain what I was talking about when I said the mortises not meeting in the middle. So right now you can see that the mortises are close, but they're not touching. And if I shade it in, we might be able to see it a little bit better. So that represents the mortise and what's happening inside the leg. If I were to make the mortise deeper, then you'd be out here, and then this mortise would, or this tenon, would then run into this tenon. First I'll adjust the depth of the mortise, and I'll loosen this Allen key. Next I'll lower the chisel to the appropriate depth. Then I push down the stop until it dead ends into the base. And then tighten the Allen key. Now I'll adjust the fence. If you'd rather build this bench with pocket hole screws, simply subtract 1 1/4 inches from the apron measurements that are in the plans. I've drawn an arrow on each side of the leg that I want to keep against the fence, and that will keep me from making any mistakes while I'm cutting the mortise. I've also drawn lines on a piece of tape, and I'm using these lines as stops. So I have lines to the left of the chisel and lines to the right of the chisel. I've readjusted the fence to make the mortise a bit wider. After cutting the mortises with the mortising machine, I cleaned them up a little bit with a sharp chisel. The next step is to move on to the apron, and I'll get started by cutting the boards to a rough length. After ripping the boards to width, I'll set up the crosscut sled and cut the boards to length. The next step is to cut the tenons. I'll adjust the height of the blade and get a good fit on a piece of scrap wood before cutting the tenons on the parts of the apron. After cutting the tenons and making sure that they fit in the mortise, I gave the parts of the apron a good sanding, and the next step is to add a slight bead at the bottom of the apron. To do that, I'm using a bead molding bit in the router. If you have a router table, that's probably a better way to go. Since I don't, I'm using my handheld router, and I've made a little jig on my workbench to hold the workpiece in position. Okay, so I've just glued up the front and back of the bench. I used a wet rag and a wet paintbrush to remove any of the glue squeezed out. I'm going to let the glue set up overnight. Tomorrow I'll remove the clamps, add the two sides, clamp it back together, and then the base of the bench will be finished. The next step is to move on to the top. The top of the bench is going to measure 52 by 15 inches, and that means I'll need to join two boards together. And whenever you're joining boards together, it's really important to get the best grain match that you possibly can, especially when you're working on a top. And that's something that really takes place in the lumberyard. So definitely take your time in the lumberyard, line the boards up. A little extra time in the lumberyard can really make a big difference in your project and save you a lot of time in the shop. For this project, I'm using cherry. And one of the nice things about cherry is you can often find boards with sapwood. And sapwood is at the edge of the board. It's just before the bark. And for this project, I'm going to line the boards up at the sapwood, and that will make the seam virtually disappear and also add a nice design element to the project. After cutting the boards to a rough length, I run them through the joiner to put a straight edge on one side. Next, I use the table saw to rip the boards to width. With the boards cut to a rough length and the edges joined, I'm ready to join the two boards together. And to do that, I am going to use a biscuit joiner. I know there's been a little controversy about biscuit joiners lately, but I've been a fan of biscuit joiners since the late 80s, and I think they make joining boards together really easy and convenient. If I were to buy another one, I'd probably buy a Makita. This one's okay, but it's not great. When I'm laying out for the biscuits, I like to keep the first biscuit about 6 inches from the outside edge on both sides, and then keep the biscuits about 10 inches apart. It's also good to keep the biscuits about 3/8 of an inch below the surface of the top, because the biscuits can telegraph, which means under a certain light you can actually see where the biscuits are. And I know that because I made that mistake on a coffee table I built about 20 years ago. And when I look at that coffee table in my living room, I can actually see where the biscuits are. So just keep that in mind. You want to have some space between the biscuit and the surface of the top. So now I'm ready to mark out where the biscuits will go, and then we can join these boards together. I think one of the problems that people have with biscuit joiners is they may not know how to use one correctly. You don't want to reference off your table. You have to reference off the board. So this plate needs to have all the pressure on it, and that way your biscuits will always align in the same place. The main advantage of using a biscuit joiner is to keep the boards aligned during the glue up. This kind of illustrates how the biscuit slot isn't centered. This is the top, and I've got just about 3/8 of an inch, and there's less space facing the bottom, so if there is any telegraphing, it will happen at the bottom and no one will see it. After the boards are clamped together, I'll use a little sawdust to remove most of the glue squeeze out, and then a wet rag to clean up the rest. I've allowed the glue to set up overnight, and now I can unclamp the front and back and then attach the sides to assemble the bench. Next, I'll unclamp the top and cut it to size. For an added design element, I'm cutting the top at a 5-degree angle. Using tape will minimize tear out and make for a cleaner cut. After using my circular saw to cut the top to length, I'll set the 5-degree angle on the table saw and rip the top to width. To attach the top and allow for expansion and contraction, I'll make wooden clips that will fit into slots made with the biscuit joiner on the inside of the bench. I've raised the blade and adjusted the fence to 1.25 inches to make the rips. I marked a stop line on a piece of tape. Next, I'll use the bandsaw to add a little shape to the clips, and then I'll use the belt sander to give the clips a quick sanding and remove the blade marks. I've adjusted the height of the biscuit joiner to accept the wooden clips. This will allow the solid wood top to expand and contract. After sanding the top and the base down to 220, I'm finally ready for finish, and for this project I'm using Waterlock's Original. I'll use 4 coats on the base and 6 coats on the top. Okay, well, I'm real happy with the way this bench turned out. It's always nice to kind of look back. You can see how the wood has warmed with age. And it doesn't take too long for cherry to darken like this, usually just about 6 months. When you're working with cherry, it kind of has that pink color. It's very light. And within about 6 months, it gets to that nice, warm, kind of honey brown color. The legs on the project, a little bit of a challenge maybe, at least for me. But like I said, if you don't have a lathe, you could build the same bench with tapered legs. You don't have to use mortise and tenon. You could build the bench with pocket hole screws. And I just think it's a nice looking piece of furniture that would look great in any home. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time. And just a reminder, if you like this project, don't forget to check out the cherry entrance table and the cherry game table. I'll have links to the project videos and plans down in the description below.